Prize winner for 2013 or
2014.
14.
Yeah.
14. Have you ever written anything that hasn't won a prize or been shortlisted or acknowledged or critically acclaimed?
Well, I've never written anything that has satisfied me as much as writing this did, you know.
Wow, okay.
You know? And there was something almost sort of magical about the way in which the whole thing flowed through, you know.
Yeah.
I'm particularly thinking of, for many years I thought I would never be able to write a novel. I didn't know how I could sort of crack the kind of code of how to write a novel, you know. And I had written plays before, I had written short stories, I had written a lot of journalism, features, articles and things. But I thought, you know, a novel is sort of beyond me. And perhaps it was because my brother in Canada, he wrote 3 novels, one after the other, which suddenly sort of made him a very famous, worldwide famous figure. So I thought, you know, I can do it too, why not?
You know who the brother is, right? It's Rohinton Mistry.
Yeah, so and it so happened at that time I also was diagnosed as having a sort of severe illness, an ailment which, you know, made me feel that, okay, it's either now or never, because this is sort of... And I think that writing my first novel had a therapeutic effect in terms of helping me to get well, and I've stayed well pretty much, you know. So that is one thing. I don't know how I'm getting sort of a bit straying from what we began with.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, we came to hear you, not me. So
No. So that the thing that about writing this book is, again, that first novel, which I think is a very good novel, and it's been now republished by Aleph. It's called The Radiance of Ashes. But that novel, you know, I felt when I wrote it that it had a sort of theme which was so universally appealing that, you know, I thought it would do very well, you know, that the book would do very well. And in fact, it was published by Picador UK, and they so completely messed up the distribution, publicity, and everything they could mess up. So the book really didn't make any mark in India. You know, it was very expensive. It was not. It was then published in India as well, but in a totally shabby form. So the theme of that novel was about the kind of social cruelty one witnesses in a city like Bombay, you know. And the character was thinking to himself, what does it do to live with this kind of misery of, you know, extremes of poverty and riches, and you know, the whole grotesquerie of the contrast, you know. And he felt that it would sort of, in some way, sort of make a person schizoid in his mind, because he would want to cut off that sort of diseased part of reality, you know, and so on. That was the theme. But when this book didn't really make a mark, I thought, sort of almost with a perverse kind of intention, that now, then in my next novel, what shall I write about? And I said, let me take a very small area, a very small arena, a very small kind of platform, which is totally sort of minimalistic, or, you know, which is microscopic almost, because it is a Parsi community itself is, as you know, very microscopic, and within that is this small subcaste of people who are the corpse bearers. You know, you could probably count them on your fingers, the number of people who are employed as corpse bearers, and they belong to a sort of caste which is hereditarily sort of passed on. You know, the son takes over the father's profession. It's changing a little bit now, and people are trying to break out. But in the time when the book is set in, it starts in the 1940s. It was very much stricter, the segregation and so on, and all the kind of customs imposed upon them, what you can do, cannot do. They were not allowed, for instance, to eat or drink anything when they before they took a corpse. You know, in those days they didn't have horses and things, so they used to actually carry them physically, bring them from the house of the deceased person to the Dungarwadi, or what is known as the Towers of Silence. And then after that only they could eat and drink and so on. That sort of, these kind of things were there at that time. Now it's much more relaxed. But now, of course, there's a problem that there are not too many vultures around anyway. So,
not too many Parsis around either, actually.
Yes. But So this is what I'm thinking also of was the kind of flow of the novel, you know. I always had a problem of wanting to not write something which is chronologically
I
linear,
wanted to ask you about that.
you know.
Actually,
And so this is what happened very sort of smoothly and magically for me. The kind of fluidity of the change of the time planes, you know.
Yeah.
Because it starts in the past and it goes, you know, and this boy who is the son of a priest, actually a high priest of a temple, he falls in love with this young girl who's kind of, you could say, nymph-like, and she's living in this really deeply forested kind of part of Bombay, which is, in the 40s it was probably much more forested than it is now. Even now it is an island of total sort of peace and beauty, you know. And he meets this girl, she's the daughter of a corpse bearer, and she dies actually very soon after he marries her. So the novel keeps moving on these various planes of past and present, and also brings in, these people are so cut off from the world outside, you know, that they only hear about the Quit India movement on a sort of small crackly radio which one of them has, you know. So that is the only connection with the outside world, really, because at that time they were not even allowed to go outside the Tower of Silence, outside that whole precinct, you know, because they were supposed to contaminate, you know, because of the closeness to dead bodies. Or now this is one thing which about the Zoroastrian scriptures, they believe that any dead matter contaminates, you know, so they have to go through all kinds of rituals after they're dealing with dead bodies and things like that. So I suppose it's common to various communities, but very few people know that it also exists among the Parsis, you know.
The extremity of the outcastness of the corpse bearers is quite shocking, because, you know, there's not many of us know a lot about Zoroastrianism, and also it reminded me a lot of Hinduism, actually, the kind of the obsession with purity and pollution that is at the heart of the caste system in Hinduism. I was really surprised to find in another religion as well.
Right.
But I wanted to, you mentioned Radiance of Ashes, which, thanks to you, I read with great pleasure earlier this month. It's marvelous. I mean, it's a sort of coming-of-age novel in a way. It's very much a novel about Bombay, and I see exactly what you mean, that the canvas in Ashes is really quite large, and in this one, you know, so it's sort of a telescopic zoom onto this hillock. But I have to say, Cyrus, the novels are what, 5-7 years apart? You wrote Radiance?
Almost 7 years.
Yeah, I cannot tell you, and I don't know if I should say this, you're so much better a writer now. You know, the sort of, all the words you use, the fluidity, the folding in of the time and space planes, the sort of, the infinitely subtle nuances in the characters. Do you feel you're a better writer now? And if you are, what does being a better writer mean to you?
Well, I mean, if I'm asked about this, I would only say that it must be better, because it came so easily, you know. It came so easily and so perfectly sort of fell into place, you know. And I'm also a better person now, I hope, in some ways, because after that first novel was really a part of getting well, you know. It was quite a serious illness, and I felt disturbed by getting ill like that. And then I thought, I mean, that was, as I said, therapeutic kind of. But I think it's still a good novel, it's worth reading. And luckily they've republished it with a very nice cover. It's a new edition.
I find actually, you know, when you say that you're a better person now, Radiance of Ashes is a sort of existential, political novel, right? But this is a tenderness. I mean, there is a tenderness in Corpse Bearer that is very, very moving. And it's not mawkish in any way. It's not sentimental. It doesn't bring you to tears. But there's a there's a lump, and I think it's that beautiful child, that Sepile. You know, she, as you said, she's nymph-like. She lives in this almost unreal place. She is a child of nature. There's something sort of bucolic about her, and there's also she's so insubstantial. She's so ephemeral, and she leaves us so quickly.
That's right. Yeah. Because she dies almost in the first paragraph of the novel. You know that she's died.
Yeah.
So everything else, but at the same time, she's a presence in the novel right through. You know.
Yeah.
In spite of that.
She's lovely. I wanted to ask actually. There's something. There's something very the Garden of Eden. That's almost, right? That there's an innocence about their love, there's an innocence about their youthfulness, and it is a great love. It's not, and I think that great love is induced by the fact that they find each other in this natural space, right? And then she dies because she's bitten by a serpent.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, here it comes, the snake. But I wondered if that was, the snake bite, was it for us to remember resonances from Genesis, or was it just a way to kill her?
Yes. No, I mean, not just a way to kill her, but it seemed fairly natural it should happen because it's quite a wild place, you know, and there are plenty of snakes there even now. So I imagine there must have been many more then.
Right.
But yeah, the resonance of that Garden of Eden was there in my mind because I cannot think of this Towers of Silence in any other terms.
Yes.
Because it is really in a place like Bombay, which is so wild nowadays, you know, it's so overgrown and congested. Here's this overgrown forested area. It's like a small island of about 55 acres, prime property. If it were sold now, it would
you could buy the whole of Bangalore,
yes,
I think.
probably, yes.
But also, you know, I mean, speaking of Radiance of Ashes in the way that you did, it's a novel, as you said, of brutality, of how cruel we can be to each other, and it's located in Dharavi, and you know, on the streets, and in Bhaikala, Majgaon, and this is almost a respite from that. Even I think for yourself as a writer, to be in this verdant landscape must have just been restful to the eyes.
Yes, but that is one aspect. But also, I wanted to try and use that very minimal kind of platform to raise larger questions about, which are sort of philosophical questions about whether there is any kind of morality operating in the universe, whether there are laws of good and evil, whether the universe itself is a kind of conscious entity which responds to these things, you know, to actions. And
we know that one of your brothers is a philosopher. So,
I'm a very poor philosopher, and that's why I can only, when I talk about these things, I start stuttering and sort of talking slowly. But I mean, I would love to write.
Yeah.
I mean, writing is the only thing that makes me feel confident when I'm writing. But when I'm talking, I'm not very confident.
Okay, I'm going to just ask you one more question, and then perhaps you'd like to read a little bit.
Sure.
So, in the sort of afterward, as it were, you mentioned that it's in 1991, which is 25 years ago, that you first learned about this Kandya strike.
Yes.
Right, the strike that these corpse bearers sort of implemented.
Yes.
But the novel Corpse Bearer, which has as one of its defining moments the strike itself, came 25 years later. So
yes. No, so it was in 1991 that I was researching a subject, this same subject of the corpse bearers of the Parsi community, for a producer who wanted to make a documentary for Channel 4 London on the subject. But the film was never made. You know, I just wrote a kind of treatment paper which he presented to the Channel 4, and they rejected it because they didn't want to make that. And it would have been impossible for them to make film in the you know, so it would never have worked out. But during that time, I met this person who was he was himself a Khandya working there, but now he's no longer there. He's left, and he's become a race course.
Yeah, the bookie.
Yes. But he said that his father had sort of served a whole lifetime of being a Khandya, and he was not from that same community. He was somebody who had been deliberately, as in the case of this character, forced to become a Khandya for the sake of love, because he loved a girl who was. So that is the only thing which comes from true life. But there was no priest or priest family.
Right.
So that is all my invention, to make the boy from the priest family and so on. But what also fascinated me about this, when I heard about this, is that, if this can be a form of vendetta, that you feel that, okay, you better declassify yourself and then we'll see what happens, And if it was so satisfying to the family, the family of the boy was being punished by a sort of cousin or somebody who wanted to take revenge on that family. So if that could have happened, how terrible must the situation have been, to
I will make you into a Khandya. Very much I felt when I was reading it. Well, one of the questions I had for you was, how did the structure of the book come about? But you said it just flowed, And there are deeply metaphysical, philosophical passages, right? And I wondered, and I don't think this is a rude question, but it's a fairly probing one. I wondered if whether in some way, Cyrus, in this book, you're actually examining the tenets of your own faith, the faith that you were born into, right, or Zoroastrianism. And now when you talk about, is the universe moral? Does the universe respond to cruelty, to brutality, to kindness, to tenderness? I felt it was very... I keep wanting to use the word moving because I'm very moved by this book, but it's very moving, that exploration not only of Zoroastrianism but also the individual, And I think Fromrose on the one hand, who is so dogmatic about his priestliness, and Feroz, who's so willing to give it up so easily, and then Temu on the other end, Kavrana, the sort of cretinous people, and how all of these types of people can exist on a spectrum of faith within any community. So I was wondering if you're actually exploring Zoroastrianism and your own relationship to it. You can give a short answer and say no.
No, not consciously I wasn't really, because I moved away from Zoroastrianism from the age of 16 or so.
Right.
I've stopped practicing it. And little later, when I was about 20 or 22 or so, I got very interested in Buddhism, and I practiced that, in fact, as one sort of segment or section of Buddhist practice. But I suppose, because that is also in a way very universal, and that's what appealed to me about Buddhism, because one of the things it says is that all of us have the Buddha nature within us, and nobody, even the vilest kind of criminal, also has that, so that you never write off anybody. So maybe that has, in a way, affected what I'm searching for, the answers I'm searching for in the book.
Because everybody has their moment of redemption. Even Temu, sort of. Would you want to read to us one of your favorite passages, or your least favorite passage?
No, I'll read it. Passage which I don't normally read, because my favorite passage is a more dramatic one, which is where he goes to that Sufi dargah in the beginning, and this dargah, they have a sort of ceremony. This I've seen myself when I was a kid, and that dargah doesn't exist anymore, but every evening they would have a huge kettle drum on which the one of the people there, priest or whoever he was, used to play a kind of a tattoo, a sort of drum beat for about 20 minutes, and this drum beat would get faster and faster, and there were people who were brought there who were chained up, who were considered mad people, and these people would get into a kind of frenzy and dance, and then finally in exhaustion sort of collapse. And this was supposed to be a kind of cure for them, people brought them there to be cured. So that is a nice passage to read. But I think I'll read something which is related to what we were just talking about. This is when Firoz, this corpse bearer, one evening, after work, he takes his daughter out for a walk in the woods, and I'll just read. Now older, Farida didn't like being carried about in mine or anyone else's arms. For me, there was nothing more pleasurable than to lift her lightweight, elfin body and squeeze it tenderly against mine as we strolled through the bamboo grove or pear orchard in the fading evening light. This was the only free time I found to spend with her after my work was done and she had put away her school books. I liked to take her out, away from Temuras's obstinate fussing, but already she had discovered she didn't like being carried as much as she enjoyed walking beside me, like a grown-up, conversing with me with the thoughtful circumspection of an adult. On one evening that I can recall, she seemed to be in low spirits. Her moodiness reminded me of her mother, Sepide. For a while she didn't object to my carrying her, but within minutes she said rather firmly, "Put me down, Daddy." After only a short distance of walking hand in hand, her tiny palm smothered in my coarse and calloused one, a faint tremor informed her voice as she whispered this question that was, I realized, at the brooding swirl of a sadness. "Daddy, why did the snake bite my mummy?" Well, I thought for a long time before answering. Snakes don't know right from wrong. Your mother must have stepped too close to that cobra. He must have been scared she would harm him. Mummy would never harm anyone. She loved animals. He didn't know that. He was scared. And she didn't see him until he bit her. Your mother loved all creatures. She would feed the squirrels with her own hand, and they were not scared to come up close and nibble. Stray dogs, peacocks as well. That snake didn't know all this, you see. But then why? She let the question trail off. Farida was perhaps not able to state in words what she wanted me to clarify, but I sensed her meaning. Even had she found the words, I'm not sure I would have had the answer. It was a question that has troubled me for several years. Through childhood and youth, I cultivated as well as earned the reputation of being a good-natured simpleton. But despite willingly abiding in this rather low-brow realm, I remember harboring always a secret yearning, even a quiet confidence, you might say, that there had to be some overarching meaning to the universe. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling this and don't deserve any special credit for it. It's probably something about the way our brains are wired that makes us humans crave this grand design. Some of us, like my father, even believed they had grasped it and harnessed it, that there is some divine formula or secret equation that connects every phenomenon of existence, every shimmering facet of life and death. Father believed this divine secret wasn't accessible to everyone, that it required deep and great faith to comprehend. But I've noticed elaborate systems of belief have been concocted and espoused over centuries by men merely to buttress this sad need for meaning, indeed to make life's transience bearable. Perhaps the question Farida had been unable to verbalize was just this. If her mother loved animals so much and cared for them, then why in our little garden of paradise did the reptile have to infect our happiness so conclusively, so irreversibly? Was there simply no justice or propriety in this universe? Thanks.
Thank you. That's lovely. And as you said, that is sort of, that is the human condition, you know. And now I hear it as Buddhism. I mean, I can really hear that Sarvam Dukkam Dukkam, and why does this happen? Okay, I just have two more questions and then we'll ask other people to join the conversation. in a sense, the heart of the book is the two women, Sepide and the little girl, Farida. Right? So, but they're surrounded, Feroz is surrounded by this really funny, warm, cantankerous community of men. The other Kandhyas, that Rustam and then that horrible Kavrana. And then that is such a beautiful creation. I mean, in American parlance, you'd say, "Oh, this is a buddy story, a buddy story." Because there's a lot of male bonding and there's enormous kindness towards each other, and they're always looking out for each other and helping each other. And Rustam is one of my favorites actually. How do you fill out minor characters? What are they real people that you know that you're just transposing onto the page, or?
Possibly there will be some real person who's a fragment of whose personality or manner of speech or something has seeped into my writing. It is very possible. It must be. Otherwise, how it doesn't invent all this. But it's not consciously sort of, fitted in or anything. There's nothing like that really. And it's partly, I think, my experience as a playwright, which comes into this.
Exactly.
Because, initially I thought of myself just as a playwright. I never thought I could write a novel or anything else. And I wrote first one play, which when I was only 21 actually, which was called Dungaji House. And this play was written for a competition, which was a sort of international competition really, because for playwrights all over the world to participate. And it was sponsored by Theatre Group in Bombay. So one of the conditions of the contest was that the prize-winning play would be staged by the Theatre Group. So my play won the first prize. But for a long time the play was not staged, and they didn't come out in the open and tell me why. So they kept making all kinds of excuses, the directors were in charge of that group. One of the excuses was, "Oh, you have created a character like King Lear, where will we find an actor to play this character?" Then they said that, "Can you make little small changes in this scene or that scene," which I worked on and I made some changes. So for nearly 10 years, they went on making excuses about not staging the play, And finally, one of the directors of the theatre group told me, quite frankly, they told me formally in a letter, saying that, "See, we don't think that this play has commercial potential, so we're afraid we can't put it up." So now the thing about plays is that unless you see it on stage, and I was a very young playwright for the first time I'd written something, and unless you see it, you can't know whether it works or not. The lines are working, whether you can speak them out or not. So I didn't write another play until in 1991, which is something like, 12, 15 years later. Tony Patel, the wife of Guy Patel, the late Tony Patel, she directed it. It was a great success, and they were totally wrong, because it was commercially also successful, because even though it's an offbeat sort of play, which is unusual for English theatre, it had many shows, and it was very popular. And as soon as the play was produced, the next year I wrote another play. So and I did feel for a long time that plays come very much more naturally to me to write. The dialogue is much more easier, and I thought I would never be able to write a novel because, long passage of prose and all. I wouldn't think I could do it. And I didn't even know how to structure a novel. So then it fell into place somehow.
Well, of course, the other person who wrote a play for his first play at 21 was Girish Karnad, right? And so you're in very good company. I would imagine that a play is so hard to write because it's entirely dialogue driven. But I very much take your point that because somewhere in your head you are a playwright, your so-called minor characters are actually very full and very believable, and they have immediate personality.
Those minor characters sort of fill out the substance of the novel.
Absolutely.
Because that's how it is in a play. Someone just sort of pops in and says something.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to have other people join the conversation, and I'll reserve 2 questions for later. So please. Nobody has any fuss with them.
Maybe many people haven't read the novel. So.
How many people have read the novel? Okay, so let me ask you this then. Again, in a writerly vein. Sorry, please, Janki. Yeah.
You were talking about being a playwright and novelist. I mean, Arsha, I think did ask you, but how do you, step from one to the other? Two different genres.
Yeah. I mean, I guess totally out of necessity, I stepped into trying to write a novel because I knew, firstly, that I had been writing for 25 years, writing all kinds of things, plays and short stories, and mostly journalism. But I had barely eked out a sort of living for myself doing that, And I knew that my brother in Canada had just written 3 novels, and he'd suddenly become the most famous sort of Parsi writer, I mean, of course, unfortunately, my brother stopped writing now because since 2002 he hasn't brought out anything, and he doesn't. When I write to him, I mean, we are good friends in a way, but he doesn't seem to be working on anything. He just feels too tired now to write anything, and all his books have been about Bombay. So whatever experiences he had taken with him 40 years ago, he's tried to build on that, but he's, I think, exhausted that really. Right. So that's an unfortunate aspect, but he's a very good writer too, a very good storyteller. I mean. So why did I come to that?
Because how do you do both genres? Yeah.
So I realized now that firstly there was this illness thing, I got this, I was diagnosed as having multiple sclerosis, which can be quite severe, and it's a very disarming, disorienting kind of illness, because suddenly, I mean, what would happen is like, there are different forms of the illness, but like suddenly, one day I woke up and started limping, Then it got a little worse, and I found myself losing my sort of, even handwriting, couldn't write properly, I couldn't sign my name, things like, of course, all these symptoms sort of would come and slowly fade away, but would leave a sort of trace kind of defect, in the later on. Then once I lost my eyesight completely, I was like seeing cubist kind of designs in the ceiling, unfell to the ceiling, and things like that, so this when this thing happened, it's very kind of unnerving because you don't know what is happening to you. You're losing control over things. So I thought, if I don't write my novel now, I will never write it. And I've been thinking for 20 years of writing a novel, which was the first novel, The Radiance of Ashes. I had been thinking of it and making notes, but those notes were finally no use when I started writing the novel. And writing it really helped me to get better. That's a fact,
So are you now going to write poetry? You've done drama, you've done novel, you've done screen.
Poetry I've never been able to write. Except in college I've written a few.
In college we all write poetry, and just as well that most of us leave it behind. But please, yes.
Congratulations on winning the award. This is the question is concerning writing and winning something actually. I've tried writing on and off, and I don't think I'm very good at it, but I'm still trying. For you as a writer, when was the first time that you actually felt like you sort of accomplished being the writer? Was it after winning an award for a playwright or winning an award for the book as an author?
Yeah, as Arsha sort of referred to this, I've been quite lucky with prizes. I mean, the first prize, even though it took them 10 years to sort of acknowledge it, and for me to get the play produced by somebody else, the actual prize was 5,000 rupees. It was a princely sum in those days, 1978, And it helped me to leave off. In fact, in the same year that I wrote the play after I got thrown out of JVS College. So for 3 years I took a break and wrote the play, and I was able to support myself because of the prize money. And at that time I started feeling I could go on writing. But then I sort of wandered into this thing of doing journalism, thinking that would be support me. But I found it more of a squandering of my own energy and talent, you know. Even though I wrote some good pieces on it, which someday I hope I can compile and publish, but it wasn't.
You need to be
pointed.
really careful
Yeah.
about that, you know, squandering. You know, writing for money, we
Yeah,
both do
yeah,
that, or we
yeah.
both done it, and it's amazing what it takes out of you.
And
how
then I
you
used to,
yeah.
I mean, because I was married and I felt I had to support my wife, and I started doing a lot of, she's a film director, she's sitting right at the back there.
Hello,
and-
Jill.
So she's made some documentary films and things, but I started doing a lot of film scripts to help her to try and find a producer, and then documentary film scripts as a way of earning some money and all this. But it led to nothing really. It was just a squandering of one's own time and
Yeah.
energy, you know.
Yeah.
But finally, as you asked me, I mean, that when it was time to, I had to wake up and say, okay, you're not well, you better do something now, write a novel, and hopefully you get published. And luckily, again, there I was very lucky, because the Piccolo UK, some friends of mine were searching for material to compile an anthology of Indian writing. So I'd given them this one or two short stories I'd written, which was supposed to be the first 2 chapters of the novel. And that they showed to the editor of Piccolo, and they gave me £30,000 for writing a book, you know, finishing the novel, which was like an amazing amount of money, for 20 lakhs in rupees, you know. And like it was good to feel that, okay, so they're willing to pay you that much. So, I finished the book, and I got better health-wise, and
That's an amazing story,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
That the book made you well.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, everybody doesn't get an award for everything that they have. It's really
Yeah.
true.
No.
I just have one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Please go.
No, I was just going to say that it is the kind of focusing of the mind while trying to write, that makes me feel well, you know, and that's what helped me to get well. Even now, if I don't write, like ever since this prize, since January, I've not been able to write at all, because there's been so much hullabaloo and
They're working you very hard,
Yes.
these DSC people, yeah.
so not just them, but the press and everyone who wants.
Of course.
But I really don't feel good when I'm not writing. You know? Unless I can write for a few hours every morning.
There's something surprisingly
Yeah.
meditative about
Yes,
writing.
yes.
I mean, I feel like I'm happiest when I'm
Yes,
translating.
absolutely.
You know, it's just
Yeah.
like everything, the world around you just stills.
Everything falls into place, and even your own life, and that is the main argument, I suppose, for the relation between the external reality and the mental reality. You know? The sort of,
Yeah.
I mean, if everything's working well for you in your life,
Yeah,
you can
absolutely.
be sure that, you know.
Did you think you were going to win the DSC prize? Tell the truth. There's 3 of us here. 4, including Jill, who were with you when that happened.
I was hopeful that I might,
Yeah.
because I thought it was a good book, and
Yeah.
I had not read any of the other books, but I had read the previous year's winner,
Right.
Jeet Thayil's book,
Right.
and
Also a Bombay book.
yeah, it's a Bombay book, and for that reason, actually, I thought maybe this time they won't give us another Bombay writer
Right.
and a Bombay novel, but I was just sort of secretly praying and hoping that I would get it. Yeah.
Sorry.
Because
continue.
for one thing, I had accumulated debts of more than this very handsome prize of $50,000. You know, so it's the biggest prize we have, and I think
Yeah.
you know, in this part of the
Yeah,
world.
yeah.
So
Any
and
part of the world. Isn't it the biggest literary prize?
the Booker Prize, it helped me to clear up my debts and not leave anything for my son too. So
But Jill, your wife said a very beautiful thing that night. She said, DSC has made it possible for a writer to be a writer again. And I found that it brought tears to my eyes. Sorry, young lady, you had a question which we have not let you ask.
yeah.
Sorry. This may seem a little romanticizing the idea of writing, which I hope that it is. What was your defining moment when you knew that you finished the book? How did you feel after you knew that this was the last word written and that you were not going to make any changes or anything in the book?
Yeah, there's something about the process of writing, you know, which is that, I mean, I'm talking about writing fiction now, you know, and in fiction, I think it's very important that every time, when one is writing, one should be able to achieve that state, and that state is that you don't really have, even though I had a sort of general idea of what the novel was about, I didn't really know where one thing was going to lead to, and what should really ideally happen is that one word or one line should lead to the next line, you know, and the one para should lead to the next thing, you know, and that kind of is the only real pleasure in writing. But writing is a terrible thing, as you probably know yourself. I mean, it's a very grueling kind of thing, you know. But when this happens, you get the pleasure of really writing in fiction, and it's like a game of, you know, like the children play this game of passing the parcel, and you unwrap the present and you take out one wrapping and then you take out the other wrapping and finally you come to the parcel, the gift itself, you know, and that's how it is really, because I didn't know it until I finished the book that it would end in this way, and that is the good thing about it. That's why I think it works, you know, and there's a kind of almost miraculous sort of or redemptive sort of ending, like this finding the earrings which he, you know.
But you know, Jackson Pollock, the great painter, he was asked, how do you know when you're done painting? And he said, how do you know when you're done fucking? You know, he says, you just know. When the book is ready, the book is, you know. I think there was another hand up somewhere. Lots of hands. Ladies first, and then I'll ask her. Yeah.
First of all, I'm really, really honored to be in your presence. Thank you for writing such a beautiful novel.
You read the book? Yeah.
No, not yet.
Okay.
But I really like the subject that you
Okay.
chosen. So the thing I want to ask you is something to do with your community, because you've chosen this particular topic, the Parsi community. And to give you a bit of a background, please bear with me. I went to a Parsi school in Bombay, J.B. Vacha, and so I've grown up with a lot of Parsi friends. And my best friend is Parsi.
Okay.
So she married out of her community. As we all know, there's like a crunch of Parsis. There's not enough Parsis in the world, and people are marrying outside the
Yes.
community. And she has been asked by the Agyari, the priests, to give up her rights over the religious things that she would like to, like if her mom passes away,
Right.
she can't actually
She can't attend the funeral.
Exactly,
Yeah.
she can't attend the funeral anymore. And she's very, very unhappy about this, and she's trying to, she was just telling me the other day, like I don't know how I'm gonna do that. Bear with that, that's sort of a tragedy. So I know you said that somewhere when you were young you moved away from your religion and you adopted things like Buddhism and something more.
Yeah.
So my question is, the Parsi community has been the most forward-thinking kind of space in India, especially. And that emancipation that comes with your kind of thinking and your upbringing and things that you espouse. How does a community like this, how does a member like yourself, who's outspoken, who's out there, who's has the power to influence people, how do you reconcile that you can be so out there in the future, so embracing of so many, mind-boggling concepts, and yet the tradition holds you back in a way that stifles?
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that?
Well, first of all, I must correct you about, certainly there is something progressive about the Parsi community, but that was especially during the British Raj, when they had a very good relationship with the British, and I think ever since the British left and we got independence, it's been slowly declining, and their position is no longer strong economically, nor sort of in terms of this progressive aspect, and there's a very strong faction of orthodox, ultra-orthodox kind of reactionary thinkers, or sort of people who control the Parsi Panchayat, and the people who, in fact there's a case going on, I believe, about a woman, a case in the High Court or Supreme Court somewhere. A woman has been again, like this year, saying she was denied that she can't come to the funeral of her mother or something like that, and she's trying to fight a case about that. So I myself also sensed very strongly that there's this opposition. Like my son, I never thought I would try and raise him as Parsi. I didn't ever even think it would be possible. Because my wife is a Christian, and I know that if I were to try and bring him up as a Parsi and make him have a Navjot, a thread ceremony for him, then there would perhaps be a faction of Parsis who would sort of turn up there, say, sort of opposing it and wanting to. And I think that was so kind of traumatic for my son that I thought it better not to enter into that area at all. So, I mean, I just think that what you're asking is a fair question, but I don't think it's so progressive anymore, really, the community. And it's very backward thinking, because even this whole thing about not allowing conversion and so on, it's become such a rigid thing, and there's such a strong faction which opposes. First they said that, okay, if you're the Parsi boy marries a non-Parsi girl, the children can be Parsis. But that was in 1906 or something, that was a court judgment. But there's a very, very strong faction which says that no way does either boy or girl lead to Parsi children. You have to be born a Parsi.
But also I just think...
Why did J.R.P. Tata being a Parsi when his mother was...
That's the case I'm talking about, 1906, about there was something in that family itself which led to this judgment.
But let's also not forget that this is hardly unique to Zoroastrians or Parsis. We all have extreme fanaticism in the faiths into which we are born, and we also have progressives in the faith into which we are born. So, and I'd like to sort of...
This matter of property issues, so this is always a problem.
But I'd like to bring this back to a literary discussion, so Arun, perhaps your question will help us do that.
You mentioned something about there being a moral dilemma kind of thing in the story. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, in the act of writing, is one of the influences from a writer actually to clarify something in his own mind? To clarify a certain moral dilemma that is there.
Right.
And is that true in your case?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would find it difficult to actually think from the top of my head what is the moral dilemma, because that's the next question. But certainly writing it is because of a moral question which one is trying to sort out in some way. And something, I suppose the moral question is really about, referring to that passage I read out, that to what extent is there a kind of logic to everything that happens, sort of.
Or how can something so beautiful be so brutal and cruel as well?
Yeah.
And if you give love, why don't you get love back? And the sort
things
of
like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions? I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you write about dreams? Because there's this dream that Feroz has. It's on page 133, right? Can I read it? It's just gorgeous.
Sure.
Yeah. And I always wonder how writers write about other people's dreams. I mean, I can't even write about my own. Evidently what was in progress was my Navjot ceremony. For the burly priest standing behind me held my hands aloft, in which I held raised my kasti, blah, blah, blah. Next I was on the terrace of the fire temple, flying a kite with Vispi, but this time it was I who was in charge. Vispi was only cheering me on, guiding me with hints, strategies, tactics. The sky was chock full of other kites and very breezy. With masterful finesse, I cut them down one after another, watching them detach from the controlling strings of the manipulators, swoop and go into free fall. Even more than myself, it was Vispi who seemed to be enjoying himself greatly, yelling whoops of orgasmic delight with every kite that came a cropper. Then I was in a dark forest. It was dusk. This was my forest. On the darkening horizon, I could make out the silhouettes of the towers. In a small clearing at my feet, I was digging a pit with a shovel to bury a collection of dead animals, my own expired pets. I shoveled in a dog, a leopard, an ostrich, a porcupine, and finally, incredibly, an entire hippopotamus. Right? And there are other details in the dream. Now, you know from the book that this is very, very closely related to incidents in Feroz's life, the sort of horrific kite flying incident, with the parrot, and then his mother's love for all these animals, and, his own relationship with Vispi, and
Vispi's brother.
Vispi's his older brother, who's the perfect child, who does very well in school. And how did you write this dream? Were you in? I mean, of course, this is a dream that Feroz would have, but you're not Feroz, right? Or are you?
No, I'm not Feroz. No.
No, I'm very curious. How does it? Yeah.
I suppose.
You know, even in Ramayana there are dreams, right? And in Ramayana dreams are always bad dreams and so yeah. And I'm amazed, like what some switch I think flips in a writer's head, because you go into sort of ramped up imagination.
Right.
You know, that even though everything is imaginary, just you know, just really like putting a volume on 10 or something like that. It just I love the dreams in the book. Okay, and another question?
Yeah, I have
Yes.
a question to what this lady asked. I mean, with the fact that you are a playwright, I mean, does being a playwright actually help novelists write dialogue better from a craft perspective?
Yeah, when it comes to dialogue, I guess it does help. But otherwise, there's no real connection between the two genres. Maybe you can say that if you're a written plays, you might have a strong sense of the dramatic and how to build a scene or a dramatic moment to introduce into a chapter or something. But there's no real relation. But in dialogue writing itself, I think it does help. It helped me. I can't say in general.
When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, actually, I let out a secret.
Yes.
I actually didn't want to be a writer. I wanted to be a music composer. I was a pianist. I was studying piano, and I wanted to write music in the Western classical tradition. And but I was a very lazy guy. First of all, I couldn't practice that 10 or 12 hours a day. So my technique never developed really very much. And I realized I gave up things quite easily. So I gave it up. When I joined college and met other writers or people who are already writers or wanted to be writers, I very quickly felt I could write. And then came along this competition, so I thought, let me write this play and win 5,000 rupees.
And do you and Rohinton talk about writing a lot, or the process, or what you're writing?
Well, the thing is, I'm younger than Rohinton.
Right.
But I started writing first, and I was always considered in my family that I was the writer.
You were the writer.
And then Rohinton went away to Canada. He joined a bank. He was working in a bank. And then he started taking evening classes at the university. And then, just by chance, he wrote a short story which won a prize in the thing. And then he wrote another in a college level competition. He won a prize. And then he wrote another story which also won a prize at the college level. And then he got a Council of Arts scholarship to complete a book of stories. So he used to often send his stories to me to sort of vet and sort of comment on and so on. So in that sense, he always acknowledged that I'm the writer. And
so when he was winning all these prizes, were you jealous?
No, I was not jealous. But when he sort of became so-called world famous, which he is, I never doubt about it. I felt for a while under a cloud, sort of, that, how can there be two writers in the same family? So for some time it stopped me from writing. For maybe 1 or 2 years or 3 years, I was not doing much writing myself.
Do you think that's what's happened to him now? I thought you said it very eloquently, that his books were about Bombay and he'd stored up those experiences and those memories and taken them away, and maybe he's run out. But do you think now your increasing stature as a writer is also putting him under a cloud in the way that he has put you?
It could be, but I don't know if he has that. He may have satisfied his ambition, because he's already sort of at a certain stature. And there's no real sort of sibling rivalry or thing here.
Oh damn! I was hoping for some really good filmy story, like the competing brothers, and Okay. Anything else from anyone? Would you like to add a comment or another question or an insight or a revelation? Okay, I just want to end with a line from the blurb of the book. It's by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who is one of our very, very great contemporary poets. And you know, there's sometimes there are, like, of course, your book is full of them, but there you read somebody else's line and you say, damn, I wish I'd written that. So this is something I would have loved to have said. There's more magic in mysteries realism than there is in magic realism. Do not miss this book. I cannot tell you what a pleasure it is. You will come back to it over and over again. It will become your favorite book to give to other people, the people that you love best. Thank you so much, Cyrus, for a lovely book.
And I'd like to say also that the quote which you've given me is also one of my favorites after Arvind Krishnan. And thank you for that, because you say that, where is it?
Oh, is
Yeah,
it
yeah, it's here. I personally believe that he is the great unacknowledged writer of his generation from India. He's referring to me. Thank
yes, I have. I do believe it. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for braving the rain and the traffic. Thank you, DSC, for bringing Cyrus closer to us all.
Yeah, sure.
I'm from the DSC Prize, and I always see back end on emails. So it's very, we have a spokesman back in Delhi, and it's a very corporate structure. So I just had a few things to say that, and I'll just quickly throw on my SMS. That basically the award giving is not complete. The award-winning author travels to share his work and life with its readers. And who better than Arshia could be in conversation with Cyrus? She was a member of the esteemed panel of the jury who, chose Chronicles of a Corpse Bearer to be the winner of the DSC Prize. And it's a privilege for the DSC Prize to get the second leg of the tour in Adagulada. Thank you so much, both. Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.